Number 10. Australian UFO Site. In recent years, images of what appears to be a UFO crash site have appeared online, along with a story about how two men discovered the wreckage near the Australian town of Mount Macedon. Legend holds that the men returned hours later with some friends, only to find that the police had already cleaned up the scene. Some rumors claim that the strange-looking objects were used in the filming of the science fiction movie Knowing or the horror flick Do Not Be Afraid of the Dark, but the films were made years before the alleged discovery of the site by the two hikers. Others have suggested that the items were props from the sci-fi series Hunters. There are also people who believe that the photos are a hoax, but the plain and simple truth is that nobody has been able to prove any of the theories. Number 9. Secret Soviet Ghost Town. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union carried out top-secret research and military operations in more than 40 hidden bases and towns that were often kept a complete secret from the local population. These cities were typically built in the middle of vast forests, where their existences could be easily concealed. One such clandestine settlement, known as Skrunda-1, was located on a 100-acre property in central Latvia. It functioned primarily as a radar complex and was equipped with an early warning system for detecting incoming missiles. At its peak, Skrunda-1 was home to around 5,000 people, including Soviet military members and their families. It contained all the fixtures of a normal town, including 10 apartment buildings, schools, a gymnasium, a water tower, factories, administrative buildings, and even a theater. There were also numerous military installations, including bunkers, machine workshops, and pumping stations. After the Soviet Union fell, the Latvian government made it clear that it wanted the Russian military to leave. The two countries negotiated an agreement requiring Skrunda-1 to be completely vacant by the year 2000. The last of the residents left in 1999, leaving behind furniture, photos, toys, clothing, and other personal items which still fill the vacant buildings today, offering a glimpse into the daily lives of people who lived in a top-secret town. Like many other Cold War sites, Skrunda-1 proved too expensive for the Latvian government to rebuild or demolish, leaving its 60 buildings in a state of perpetual ruin, while authorities tried to figure out a cost-effective way to deal with it. In 2015, after repeated attempts to auction it off, the government awarded half the property to the Latvian military and announced that it would lease the other portions of the site for low rent, under the agreement that the renters develop and repurpose it. Number 8. Mucholapka. Nestled in the dense woods of southern Poland near the Czech border, there's a massive 10-sided concrete structure known as Mucholapka, or Hitler's Stonehenge. The Nazis built it during World War II when the area was considered part of Germany. Beneath the bizarre geometric monument, there's a series of underground tunnels that were built between 1943 and 1945 as part of a secret project called Riza. Researchers are unsure what the decagonal building's purpose was. Some believe that it's the unfinished base of a water cooling tower, while others speculate that it was intended as a missile launch site. Some of the more imaginative theories include the suggestion that Mucholapka was a UFO launching pad or a time travel machine. These far-flung ideas stem at least partially from conspiracy theories surrounding Hitler's death and the fact that his body was never found. For example, some people believe that Hitler didn't die in his bunker like history claims, but that he boarded a spaceship at the site and sought refuge in another dimension. While this is highly unlikely, it's just another reminder that no one truly knows what Mucholapka or the tunnels beneath it were supposed to be. Number 7. Little Pioneers Youth Camp. Europe's communist-era architecture could perhaps be best described as having a paradoxically future yet vintage look. One good example of this space-age style can be found in a collection of arrow-shaped avant-garde buildings which sit in a wooded area along Doiran Lake in North Macedonia. Known as Tito's Pioneers or the Little Pioneers Youth Camp, the boldly shaped symmetrical concrete building operated as a youth camp during Yugoslavia's communist era. It was built as part of a self-governing system of communities who are allowed to spend their money as they saw fit. The lakeside camp is just one of many publicly funded building projects that were built between 1945 and 1992 under the rule of dictator Josip Broz Tito, and it's one of 5 children's resorts that operated in Yugoslavia's Socialist Federal Republic of Macedonia. Occupying a roughly 4-square-mile area, the Little Pioneers Youth Camp welcomed children from all over Yugoslavia free of charge. At its peak, the resort employed around 300 locals. The property was abandoned in the 1990s during the Yugoslav Wars. Nearby residents are said to reflect fondly upon the drab buildings, remembering their heyday as a golden era. It's easy to reach the site, but the buildings have been heavily looted and damaged and are unsafe to explore. Number 6. Tillamook Bay Naval Complex. In 1942, the U.S. Navy built a sprawling 1,600-acre base just south of Tillamook, Oregon. It contained more than 60 buildings, including large wooden hangars with enough rooms to house 6 blimps each. For several years during World War II, blimp squadrons operated out of the base, patrolling the west coast for signs of an enemy presence. But the military's presence at Tillamook Bay was short-lived. The site was all but forgotten after the war ended, and it was officially decommissioned in 1948. Since then, its buildings have been rotting away in the Oregon rainforest, where nature is quickly reclaiming the land. The former base is so well hidden that many people supposedly don't even know it exists. Only 35 of the original structures still stand, including a hangar that was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1989. It was built with wood due to wartime rationing and remains one of the world's largest wooden structures to this day. The hangar houses the Tillamook Air Museum, which boasts an impressive collection of World War II aircraft and other vehicles. Have you ever been to this museum? Let us know in the comments below, and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 5. Woodpecker Radar. Between 1976 and 1989, shortwave radios around the world intercepted a strong signal that made a bizarre, unexplained noise. It sounded like the repetitive tapping of a woodpecker's beak against a tree, but nobody could figure out what it was or where it came from. The suspicion among experts that the sound was produced by an over-the-horizon radar system was confirmed after the Soviet Union fell and the world learned about the existence of 2 50-story towers in the remote Russian wilderness. Known as the Duga radar, it functioned as part of an early warning system that was designed to detect incoming missiles. The antennas, dubbed Duga-1 and Duga-2, were located in Chernobyl and Siberia. Duga-2 was positioned toward the Pacific Ocean with the purpose of detecting enemy missiles from the American West Coast. Unlike conventional radar, which can only see as far as the horizon, the Duga towers were equipped with extremely strong transmitters that were capable of bouncing signals off the ionosphere and seeing over the horizon. The system was designed to alert Soviet authorities about an enemy missile within 2 to 3 minutes of one being launched. But its strong signal interfered with flight, shipping, and civilian communications, including TV broadcasts. And without knowing the source of the noise, those who were perpetually annoyed by it were powerless to make it stop. Thousands of complaints poured into authorities around the world, but they went unresolved. NATO eventually tracked the signal to the Soviet Union, which denied causing the sound. In the meantime, the radar towers remained extremely well hidden in their remote wooded locations and appeared on maps as children's recreational camps. While we know the source of the noise today, there are many lingering questions surrounding the Duga radar and how it worked. Many of these curiosities may never be answered, given Russia's continued secrecy. The system is no longer in use, but the rusting towers still stand. Number 4. Yavor 51 Bunker. Built by the Czech and Soviet militaries during the Cold War, the Yavor 51 bunker is hidden deep in the Brdy Mountains in what is now the Czech Republic. After the Soviet military took exclusive control of it in 1968, it became the most heavily guarded place in what was Czechoslovakia at the time. Guards were under orders to shoot trespassers on sight, and even the airspace above the bunker was restricted. These heavy-handed policies were implemented in an effort to keep the bunker's nuclear weapons a closely guarded secret. The stockpile of nuclear warheads and short-range missiles was put in place as part of the Warsaw Pact, which required the Soviet Union and 7 of its satellite states to prepare for a possible attack or defense strike from the Western Bloc. Equipped with its own water source, power generator, and air filtration system, the complex doubled as a safe place for the area's high-ranking Soviet military members to go in the event of a nuclear war. As Czechoslovakia's power dynamics started to shift during the late 80s, Birdie's military presence gradually decreased and Havor 51 was ultimately abandoned. It was opened to the public for the first time in 2021 as the Atom Museum, and although the nuclear weapons are obviously no longer there, visitors can see some of the leftover tactical equipment and weapons. Researching the museum is somewhat of a challenge. A vague and somewhat cryptic set of directions on its website instructs guests to travel down a narrow forest path and to not be discouraged by driving through the deep forest. Number 3. Viaducto Petrobras. In the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo, there's a massive elevated road that cuts deep into the Amazon rainforest before abruptly stopping. No cars drive on it, and it's in a clear state of decay. Measuring nearly 1,000 feet long and 131 feet high, it rises up out of the jungle as a testament to an unfinished project that was put on hold for a cheaper alternative due to government misspending. Known as the Rio Santos Highway, or the Viaducto Petrobras, the crumbling highway was built during the 1960s with plans to connect it to the existing BR-101 highway. It was supposed to be completed by 1976, but in a last-minute change of plans, authorities decided to connect the BR-101 highway to a coastal highway instead. This so-called road to nowhere represents the Brazilian government's lofty ambitions at the time and the problems that many of these infrastructure projects ran into. Working conditions were reportedly torturous, and construction ground to a halt as the country descended into a major financial crisis. The highway has sat abandoned ever since. It's become a popular bungee diving site among adventurous tourists who travel to Porto Novo Salesópolis Caragua neighborhood and complete the rest of the journey on foot or by motorbike. Number 2. Prairie Observatory. Walnut Point State Park in Oakland, Illinois is home to a remote trail that leads to an overgrown, graffiti-covered dome-shaped building that clearly hasn't been used in a very long time. Known as the Prairie Observatory, it once provided astronomers from the University of Illinois with an uninterrupted view of the dark night sky, free from the light pollution of the city. Built during the 1960s, the 40-foot dome structure had an attached apartment for visiting scientists to stay in. It was abandoned in 1981 after being used for just 11 years. The telescope was relocated elsewhere, but the building itself still stands as it falls further into decay. Despite its apparent lack of upkeep, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1986 and became a National Historic Landmark a few years later. Visitors are strictly forbidden from entering the observatory, but are allowed to explore it from the outside. Number 1. Vintage Train Wreck. Deep in the woods of Whistler, British Columbia, there's a scattering of old train cars that clearly met a destructive end. They can be found between the Cheakamus River and some nearby train tracks where they derailed in 1956 and have sat ever since. Train derailments were relatively common during the 50s, but little was known about the so-called Whistler train wreck until recent years, according to the website Traveling Canucks. At the time the wreck occurred, the tracks were under construction. Speaking with the Whistler Insider, a local forester explained that the accident was most likely a slow derailment on a curve, which caused the cars to gently fall over. It appears as though the company decided it was easier to just move the damaged cars out of the way rather than remove them from the forest. The boxcars, which now serve as a de facto graffiti art gallery, were then simply left as they were, with some still connected and others sitting on the edge of the valley above the river. There was no local newspaper at the time, so much of the local population remained unaware that a crash had even happened. Although the site was once off limits to the public, it's now part of a popular hiking trail and is open to exploration at one's own risk.
8. The Govenoren. In January 1915, just 9 days after famed Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton's Endurance ship was crushed by ice and sank to its watery grave in the Weddell Sea, another disaster happened. A Norwegian whaling factory ship called the Govenoren met with disaster 800 miles away near the shore of Enterprise Island in Foyne Harbor. The whaling season had just ended, and the Govenoren's crew threw a party to celebrate their upcoming voyage home. But things got a little too rowdy between the drinking and the dancing, and someone knocked an oil lamp off a table, causing the ship to catch fire. It was one of the worst possible things that could happen to a vessel holding a large amount of whale oil, which further fueled the blaze. The captain and crew were left with no choice but to abandon ship. Luckily, all 85 men escaped without injury. They stood by and watched helplessly as the Govenoren became fully engulfed in flames and was soon rescued by another whaling ship. What's left of the wreck still sits in Foyne Harbour today. It serves as a haunting reminder of how one careless mistake amounted to a huge economic loss for the whaling industry and the workers who relied on the ship's bounty for money to support their families. 7. The Octavius. According to legend, a 3-masted schooner called the Octavius left England for a 1-year round trip to China in 1761 and never returned. Not a single trace of the ship was seen until 1775, when the crew of a whaling vessel called the Herald spotted the weathered Octavius floating aimlessly off the Greenland coast with tattered sails. Discovered roughly 250 miles above the Arctic Circle, it was extremely far from its last known route. 5 members of the Herald's crew boarded the long-missing ship and found the entire 28-man crew dead, frozen, and perfectly preserved, showing no signs of decomposition despite having disappeared 14 years earlier. The captain's lifeless body was seated at his desk, with his pen still in hand and his logbook open in front of him. Nearby, the remains of a woman and child, the captain's wife and kid, were found under a blanket. Shocked by what they saw, the crew members from the Herald hurriedly grabbed the logbook and went back to their ship. The logbook's last entry was dated to November 11, 1762, nearly 13 years earlier. Records show that the Octavius reached the Orient as planned. After noticing that the ocean's waters were unseasonably warm, the captain ordered the crew to attempt a shortcut by sailing north through the Arctic. Unfortunately, it was a decision that proved to be catastrophic. The Octavius was never seen again after the Herald's crew found it, and its logbook has also vanished, leading several modern historians to believe that the ship never existed and is entirely mythical. But researchers have also failed to trace any possible origins it could have as a fictional story, and for that reason, they haven't proven that the ill-fated vessel wasn't real. 6. The Sea Wing. Built during the 1880s in Wisconsin, the 135-foot-long Sea Wing has a steamship that moved lumber and commodities up and down the Mississippi River and moonlighted as an excursion vessel. On the morning of July 13, 1890, the Sea Wing left Wisconsin for a day trip to Minnesota, located north of St. Paul along Lake Pepin. After stopping in Red Wing, Minnesota, the steamer continued onward to Lake City with an excursion barge in tow. They spent the day at a carnival until around 7 o'clock p.m., when a sudden rain squall disrupted the fun and the captain called the passengers back on board. By then, the weather conditions were increasing to an ominous level. The sky was filled with dark, threatening clouds, and even some locals grew concerned and urged passengers to stay on dry land. Nevertheless, around 215 people boarded the ship and its attached barge. The Sea Wing encountered a violent storm and a large wave flipped the vessel, causing it to detach from the barge it was towing and capsize. All the passengers who had crammed into the ship's cabin for shelter from the storm were now upside down in the water. 98 passengers drowned, including 50 of the 57 women aboard, while 25 survivors clung to debris, climbed onto the bottom of the overturned boat, and attempted to swim for shore. The passengers in the barge were unharmed. Most of the victims were from Red Wing, leaving the community shattered with grief. An investigation found that the captain was only licensed to carry 12 passengers, and he wasn't qualified to tow barges. The number of passengers also exceeded the Sea Wing's capacity. The life vests were in terrible condition, and the ship was understaffed. Wethen lost his license, but was never criminally charged. 5. Discovery Mutiny. In one of the earliest attempts to discover a northwest sea route to Asia through the Arctic, English explorer Henry Hudson set out on his 4th major expedition in 1610 in his newly built ship, the Discovery. He crossed the Atlantic from Europe, then sailed northward between modern-day Greenland and the Canadian province of Labrador. Believing he'd stayed too far south during his previous voyages, Hudson ventured further north than it ever had before. When the ship reached the Hudson Strait, the crew became hopeful that they'd found the entry point to the Northwest Passage. They continued, but their journey came to a screeching halt several months later when the Discovery became trapped in ice. The men spent the winter trapped. When the ice finally broke the following spring, Hudson was determined to continue sailing northward, but his crew was tired, sick, and hungry, and they wanted to end the mission. Fed up with their suffering, they staged a mutiny and put Hudson, his teenage son, and 7 others in a separate boat and set them adrift in the freezing North Atlantic. The small group rowed desperately to try catching up with the Discovery, but the mutineers raised extra sails to increase their speed and get away faster, proving that it's not always the ship that doesn't make it out of an unforgiving environment, but the people who arrived with it. Nobody ever saw Hudson or his companions again after that, but it's probably safe to assume that they died in a painful battle against the elements. The mutineers fared only slightly better, with 5 of the 13 men dying during the vessel's return voyage to England. How do you think Hudson and his companions died? Tell us in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. 4. The Breadalbane. Sir John Franklin was one of numerous European 19th century explorers who competed to find a polar sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, known as the Northwest Passage. He set sail in 1845 with a 129-person crew and 2 ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror. 2 months into the voyage, the vessels became icebound in Canada's Victoria Strait. The crews remained on the ships for a year before they left on foot, despite having several years' worth of food on board. Over 100 search missions ensued over the following decade. In 1853, the British Royal Navy sent a Scottish-built merchant bark, the Breadalbane, to the high Arctic to resupply an expedition that was out searching for Franklin and his crew. The 3-masted ship made it all the way to Resolute Bay, roughly 500 miles above the Arctic Circle, without any major problems. Things took a horrifying turn one night when slow-moving ice surrounded the Breadalbane and pierced its starboard bow. The crew gathered as much equipment and belongings as they could carry and rushed off the ship as it became choked by the encroaching ice. It took less than 15 minutes for the vessel to disappear completely beneath the surface. Luckily, all 21 crew members survived and were soon rescued. The Breadalbane wreck was rediscovered in the Barrow Strait in 1980 at a depth of 330 feet. It's famous for being one of the world's northernmost shipwrecks and one of the most intact wooden saltwater wrecks ever found. Thanks to the dark and frigid conditions of the Arctic Sea, the sunken ship has sustained minimal damage over the years and is deteriorating much more slowly than a typical wooden vessel. Several artifacts were brought to the surface for preservation and display, including the steering wheel. 3. USS Jeannette. In a bid to become the first humans in recorded history to reach the North Pole, the 33-man crew of the naval exploration vessel USS Jeannette sailed out of San Francisco on July 8, 1879, with plans to reach their destination by navigating through the Bering Strait. The ship sent its last communication about 6 weeks later and then became trapped in ice. For nearly 2 years, the Jeannette drifted uncontrollably in the Siberian Sea, going wherever the ice took it. In mid-June of 1881, the pressure of the floating ice began to crush the 142-foot-long ship, and it became clear that the Jeannette was going to sink. Left with no other choice, the crew unloaded some supplies and began trekking across the floating ice on foot from 497 miles above the Arctic Circle. With 3 small boats in tow, they trudged through snow and slush that was sometimes waist-deep and encountered life-threatening brutal weather while hoping to eventually reach land. 21 crew members died during the journey, including the Jeannette's captain, George Washington DeLong. At least 1 man starved to death, and 7 others perished when their boat capsized and sank during an attempt to sail to the Siberian mainland. Parts of the Jeannette wreck were seen on an ice floe in 1884, but no trace of the ship was ever seen again after that. In 2015, Russian adventurer and TV personality Andrei Koroshev announced plans to locate and recover the sunken vessel. But finding it apparently proved to be more difficult than he thought it would be, and the Jeannette remains missing to this day. 2. Carroll A. Deering. Built in 1918, the American-built Carroll A. Deering was a 5-masted cargo schooner that ferried coal and other goods between South America, the US, and the Caribbean. It operated for just a few years before it ran into trouble off the North Carolina coast in 1921, while on its way back to Norfolk, Virginia from delivering a load of coal to Rio de Janeiro. While sailing past the Cape Lookout lightship, a crew member used a megaphone to tell the lookout's keeper that the Carroll A. Deering had lost both of its anchors in a storm. He asked the keeper to pass the word on to the ship's owner, and that was the last anyone ever heard or saw of the vessel or its crew. 3 days later, a surfman discovered the Carroll A. Deering off Cape Hatteras, where it had run aground. The area had been known as a common shipwreck site for centuries, earning it the nickname the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Due to bad weather, rescue ships were unable to reach the stranded vessel for several days. Deering's crew, logbook, and lifeboats were all missing, along with the crew members' personal belongings. The ship's rudder was disengaged from its stock, and the steering wheel was shattered. It was evident that the crew had abandoned the ship in the middle of preparing for the next day's meal, indicating that something went majorly wrong. The Coast Guard tried but failed to salvage the Carroll A. Deering. They declared the ship a navigational hazard and blew it up with dynamite. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but theories abound. Some believe that perhaps pirates or communists kidnapped the ship's crew. Others blamed bad weather, but we'll probably never know for sure. 1. SS Fort Mercer and SS Pendleton. Disaster struck not once but twice on February 8, 1952, when 2 World War II-era tankers, the SS Pendleton and the SS Fort Mercer, became caught in the throes of a brutal nor'easter off the Massachusetts coast. The Fort Mercer cracked and broke in two about 30 miles from shore, with 9 officers and crew members in the bow section and 34 others in the stern. Captain Frederick Peinzel sent out a panicked mayday call as the broken ship continued to take a beating from nearly 70-foot-tall waves. The US Coast Guard rushed to the scene as fast as they could and managed to rescue all but 5 crew members. About 20 miles away near Cape Cod, the Pendleton also snapped in two during the tail end of its journey from New Orleans to Boston. By then, the Coast Guard was already aware that the Fort Mercer was in distress, and they now had 2 broken ships that they had to try rescuing sailors from in the raging violent storm. They managed to save all but 9 of the Pendleton's crew members, including several who were trapped in the ship's bow and impossible to get to. The ship's cook also died after selflessly helping other men off the vessel. He jumped into the water as a strong gale forced the Pendleton into a sandbar and was fatally struck by his own ship when it hit a wave. He died instantly. The harrowing efforts to save the men on both ships went down in history as one of the Coast Guard's most daring rescues of all time. The Pendleton's stern remains underwater to this day, and the bow section was ultimately scrapped. Even after being ripped in half, the Fort Mercer remained afloat. It was towed to Newport, Rhode Island, where it was fitted with a new bow. In an alarming example of history repeating itself, the ship broke in half again in 1964 and was once again rebuilt. It was finally scrapped in 1983.
Number 2. Operation Desecrate One. During World War II, American naval power started to rise on the southern flank of Japan's Pacific border in 1944. The islands in this area played a crucial strategic role in protecting the conquered territories of the Philippines, Indochina, Malaya, Borneo, and the Dutch East Indies. The defense of the islands eventually evolved into an aerial conflict that the Japanese Air Force couldn't overcome in the face of American military superiority. By the end of March 1944, the majority of the Pacific had been taken over by Americans. The Japanese Navy was basically destroyed. Just a handful of warships, tankers, cargo ships, troop carriers, and a few seaplanes were left. Once the U.S. gained air control over the Palau Islands on March 30, 1944, most of the Japanese warships and commerce ships stationed there were in jeopardy and highly vulnerable to aerial attacks. The Japanese fleet had to face a barrage of torpedoes, bombs, rockets, and strafing assaults as a result of bombings known as Operation Desecrate One. Desecrate One was part of the setup for Operations Reckless and Persecution, the Allied invasion of Western New Guinea. The U.S., with the strongest navy in the world, carried out the bombing until March 31, 1944. The Japanese were unprepared. As a result, they lost well over 50 ships and countless planes. Due to its diversity, accessibility, and history, the sunken fleet in Palau is one of the most unusual collections of ships in the world. The main port of Palau, Malakal Harbor, has over a dozen world-class wrecks near or in the harbor itself. The fleet was made up of a wide range of naval and merchant ships. Only a handful of them survived Desecrate One, ranging in size from small boats like the colorful Boy 6 wreck to the 492-foot-long Amatsu Maru. The majority of these vessels are still there more than 50 years later, while they slowly decay from salt water and encrusting microbes. In the shallow lagoon, the dead fleet now acts as a network of new artificial reefs, attracting a whole different variety of fish and creatures than the drop-offs of the Barrier Reef, which are Palau's main claim to fame. In particular, the Iro served as an oiler and supply ship during its time. She was destroyed on March 30, 1944 during Desecrate One. The explosive caused significant structural and fire damage to the ship's engine room, boat deck, and stack. A survivor from the assault saw a direct strike on the engine room where nearly 30 engineers were killed instantly. Currently, this wreck is upright at a depth of 131 feet. The top of the mast is barely 26 feet off the deck as the bridge and the mast rise over top of it. Both the front and back guns remain in position. The Iro Maru is surrounded by sea life, including lionfish, clownfish, and a boatload of coral. If you wish to dive down to the site, be sure to stay away from the deadly ammo still strewn about the ship that has survived since World War II. The Amatsu Maru, with a total length of 492 feet and a beam of 65 feet, is the largest World War II shipwreck in all of Palau. It sits 131 feet below water with the deck 98 feet under the waves. It is better suited for experienced divers because of this. Those less experienced should stick to the wreck's exterior, while more confident divers can explore the inside of the oil tanker. Due to the abundance of black coral trees growing over the ship's hull creating a magnificent view, this dive site is also called Black Coral Wreck. Another ship destroyed during World War II and sunk in 1944 as a result of Operation Desecrate was the Chiyu Maru. This amazing wreck site is home to a large variety of marine life, including soft corals along the deck and rails and breathtaking black coral. Lionfish, transparent shrimp, oysters, clams, pipefish, eels, and other marine life also claim the wreck as home. The site's greatest depth is 108 feet, and experienced divers will find this spot ideal for exploration. On March 30th, 1944, just after 1 p.m., a 500-pound bomb launched the initial attack. Following reports of severe fires on board, the vessel sank at 8 p.m. on April 1st, 1944. One unnamed shipwreck that sits directly in Malakal Harbor is simply known as the Helmet Wreck because of its perfectly placed pile of Japanese helmets discovered inside her cargo holds. This little ship, which is barely 189 feet long, lies on the bottom part of the sloping harbor. The dive profile is noteworthy since the bow descends to 110 feet, while the stern can be reached at 50 feet. This wreck has a variety of fascinating points of interest, such as gas masks, ammo, and weapons. The ship is still mostly intact and in decent shape considering its watery resting place. Many destroyed aircraft provide excellent diving locations. The Jake seaplane, a Japanese Navy recon float plane, is notable among them. On top of a coral head, Jake sits upright in 49 feet of water, largely undamaged. Despite having fallen off, its engine sits near the plane. The lack of damage to its propellers suggests that the plane crashed during a landing. It wasn't discovered until 1994, when a fisherman spotted it from the surface. Aircraft operations in 1944 were designed to prepare the ground for amphibious assaults. They started in September of that year, specifically on the southern island of Peleliu. The takeover of this island was a top objective for U.S. forces because General MacArthur believed it was essential for the eventual takeover of the Philippines. The island and its airstrip had been under Japanese control since World War I. The battle was expected to last about 3 days as the first wave of the 1st Marine Battalion made amphibious landings on Orange Beach. A month of grueling warfare ensued, resulting in significant deaths on both sides. The wrecks near Palau and the surrounding islands serve as a reminder of the cruelty of war, while also giving us insight on the harsh reality soldiers and locals of that time had to face. Would you ever go diving in an old shipwreck? Let us know in the comments and subscribe if you like what you've seen so far. Number 1. Graveyard of the Pacific. The Pacific Northwest is naturally very dangerous. Risky situations are present everywhere, from sprouting volcanoes to toppling cliffs. But few places rival the Graveyard of the Pacific in terms of the number of lives lost and the amount of devastation that has happened there. The region, which contains several rocky reefs and shorelines, stretches from Tillamook Bay in Oregon, along the Washington coast, and to Vancouver Island. The Columbia River's mouth, though, is perhaps the most dangerous spot. The large river mouth, which sits on the border between Oregon and Washington, is home to changing sandbars, rough seas, and incredibly strong winds, which makes it a nightmare for ships coming in from the ocean. Europeans and Americans tirelessly searched for this river of the West and were the first to learn of the bar's wickedness. Observations of foreign ships washed up on beaches as early as 1700 are mentioned in local legend. Bruno Heceta, a Spaniard, charted the Columbia's entry for the first time in 1775, but his crew's sickness prevented any further in-depth exploration. In May of 1792, an American merchant named Robert Gray, whose Columbia Red Viva gave the river its name, actually succeeded in crossing the bar. Later, an armed tender of the Royal Navy named HMS Chatham came dangerously close to being the graveyard of the Pacific's first casualty. Then, in 1792, Captain George Vancouver sent Lieutenant William Broughton to investigate Captain Gray's report of the large river. The Columbia was explored by Broughton. Chatham ran aground on what would later be called Peacock Spit on the northern side of the river mouth as she tried to leave the river. Broughton successfully avoided losing control of his ship by racing it off the beach. At the beginning of the 19th century, merchants navigated the currents, breakers, and the shifting channels of the mouth while they exploited the area's fur supply. 5 sailors lost their lives when the brigantine Hazard sent a small boat to take soundings in 1798. In 1829, the British bark William and Anne capsized on Clatsop Spit while taking supplies to the Hudson Bay Company's Fort Vancouver. Multiple people were killed in this incident. A Navy ship of war called the USS Peacock ran aground in 1841 close to Cape Disappointment and was destroyed by high waves. No one was hurt as the team escaped by boat. Its wreckage now remains as Peacock Spit. Another Navy vessel, the schooner USS Shark, ran aground on the Columbia River bar just 5 years later. The ship was completely wrecked by the rough storms, and parts of it drifted southward down the coastline. Some of it washed up in the region known as Cannon Beach. 3 catastrophes happened in 1849 alone as seaborne trade expanded. 5 wrecks were reported between 1852 and 1853. The shifting bar was the main issue. Only months later, what used to be a safe route earlier on in the season now invited grounding and calamity. At this point, sailors finally gave the mouth the nickname Graveyard of the Pacific. One of the most notable wrecks before the turn of the century was the USS Pacific, which sank near Cape Flattery in 1875. It was one of the graveyard's deadliest shipwrecks. The Pacific's captain saw a light in the area and assumed it was the Cape Flattery lighthouse. But when he moved the steamboat west, the Orpheus, a sailing ship, was the true origin of the light. It was the worst West Coast accident ever at the time, with only 2 of 275 passengers surviving. There were 25 more shipwrecks between 1890 and 1910, a high figure for the 20th century. Off the Columbia River mouth on January 4, 1890, the schooner Dearborn was found capsizing but still floating. Her crew was never found, not even a trace of them. The steam schooner Protection, sailing from Seattle to San Francisco with a cargo of timber, perished in a fierce storm on January 1, 1900, killing every member on board. The British bark Cape Wrath, coming from Peru to Portland, was observed outside the mouth of the Columbia on January 16, 1901, but she and her 15 crew members were never seen or heard from again. Another steamboat, the Clallam, traveling from Seattle to Victoria via Port Townsend, capsized outside of Victoria Harbor on January 8, 1904, killing 56 people. The steamer SS Valencia, headed from San Francisco to Seattle, collided with Pachina Point on Vancouver Island on January 26, 1906, while trying to cross the Strait of Juan de Fuca. A total of 136 people were killed. According to some, the USS Valencia sinking was the greatest maritime accident to date in the graveyard of the Pacific. On October 25, 1906, the Peter Iredale, a four-masted steel sailing ship headed for the Columbia River, went aground on the Oregon coast. It was eventually abandoned. Since the debris is still visible, it is one of the graveyard's most accessible shipwrecks and a well-visited tourist destination. The boat simply stayed there since no one could get it out safely. It has steadily become worse for wear over the past 101 years. A sizable portion of the ship is still visible, and at low tide, it is fairly easy to get up close. One tanker's captain mistook the North Head Light for the lightship on January 7, 1913, causing the ship to slam onto the Peacock Spit before sinking. The only survivors were 4 men, who were found clinging to the rigging by rescuers. Only 3 were saved. Even then, the Point Adams rescue vessel had to sail alongside the lightship to find safety. There were about 32 fatalities. There were countless occasions where multiple steamboats were ruined by fire. On July 8, 1915, large flames broke out in Wenatchee. The majority of the Columbia and Okanagan Steamboat Company's vessels were docked near one another at a riverside barge. Chelan was the closest inshore, while North Star was on the outskirts. Columbia and Okanagan were in between. A fire started aboard North Star after 11 p.m., spread fast to vessels beside her, and destroyed them all. Although never proven, arson was heavily suspected. This fire destroyed the Columbia and Okanagan steamboats, and the Enterprise sank shortly after. Many more boats wrecked due to fires, collisions, and bad weather, floods, and more. The Columbia River Maritime Museum in Astoria reports that more than 700 people have died and 2,000 boats have sunk in the Columbia River since 1792 alone. The Columbia River Bar Pilots was established in 1846 to help vessels direct ships as they approach the river's mouth. Though the location continues to draw risk, the number of shipwrecks decreased during the 20th century with experience and large advancements in technology. The mouth of the Columbia River continues to be one of the most dangerous locations in the Pacific Northwest due to shipwrecks, waves, deserted batteries, and subpar weather. Thanks for watching. Have you ever seen a shipwreck in person? Tell us about your experience down in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to see our next video.